Well, hello, dear friends, and welcome back to the Learning Future podcast. I'm your host, Louka Parry. Today, it's an absolute delight to be speaking with, in my view, one of the most influential voices in global education. Today's guest is the Director for Education and Skills at the OECD, Andreas Schleicher. He leads the OECD's work on education policy and is best known for major international studies and reports, including the Program for International Student Assessment, commonly known as PISA. He works with governments and system leaders to better understand quality, equity, and readiness for the future. In this conversation, we're going to kind of explore the latest work, what's happening to learning systems, the role of technology and artificial intelligence, and a whole suite of really interesting reports that the OECD have been releasing recently. Hello, Andreas. It's great to see you again. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for hosting me.
My first question is always the same in these conversations, and it's a personal question around your own learning. What is something you are learning at this point? Something that's in the forefront of your mind?
Well, obviously, how we engage with technology. In the past, we used technology. We looked at technology as a tool. So did I. And I think now technology challenges in who we are as humans. And I do think that's a completely new experience that I see for myself, that I see around me.
Are you, just before we get into kind of the OECD work, as someone that is a learner yourself, and you've studied here in Australia, and you have a whole suite of different professional degrees. How are you finding your own use with some of the latest technologies that are how are you finding your workflow, your thinking influenced?
Well, I can see that a lot of things where I spent a lot of time with in the past, technology can now do equally well. On the one hand, it frees up, time for new things. I think that's really, really great. From writing a summary of a meeting to actually, summarizing reports and so on. At the very same time, you also see that, what we call metacognitive laziness. You sort of easily outsource some of your thinking. And as humans, we are always prone to trade in our autonomy for convenience. And I can see that on myself. I think that's a real risk in this world, that we give up essential human qualities simply because it seems that, technology does those things so well.
I've heard you speak many times, especially about what it means to be human in this digitizing era. I'd love you to talk a little bit about what you're noticing and seeing in terms of the role of teachers, or some of the digital education work that you've done. You released a really, I think, a pretty comprehensive report, the Digital Education Outlook, just in January gone, and it looked at the use of generative AI in education. And so, as we're talking about, cognitive offloading has pretty negative benefits, but there's also use cases that are positive. So take us into that world a little bit more around how we're seeing this technology used in learning systems.
I think the short story is that learning is always about social relationships. Learning is always about cognitive effort. You do not become fit by watching sports. You become fit by doing exercise. Yeah, and it's the same as with the brain. I think it's about investing yourself, putting your energy behind something, having a teacher who understands who you are, who you want to become, who really accompanies you on your learning journey, and where technology supports that effort, that cognitive struggle. Great, I think it can do magic. But where it undercuts that effort, it really, that's where the problems occur, where technology, makes things seemingly easier, gets us, to avoid that kind of effort of learning, becomes, particularly for children, a replacement for genuine social relationships. And I think what we need to see is that as humans, we are so much more than the sum of automatable tasks. Our capacity to build complex social relationships, our capacity to create something genuinely new, our capacity to distinguish between good and bad and right and wrong. And I think those kinds of human capabilities could get lost. And they are not just, the goal of education. They are very much the foundations of our societies, our democracies. And if teachers do not protect those capabilities with determination, then AI could wash away the very foundations of our societies. I think that's in a nutshell, it's not a magic power. It's an amazing
Mm,
amplifier and a great accelerator. It can amplify good educational ideas and good practice in the same way it can amplify bad pedagogy and bad
yeah.
practice. Now, as a teacher, it can make you the designer of the most imaginative learning environments. That's what AI can do, and it can disempower you to become the slave of algorithms. Now, and I
Mm.
think that difficulty is to navigate that landscape. No?
I, when I first came across the Education 2030 work some years ago, Andreas, it really shifted my lens, especially the learner compass and the more recently released teaching
Hmm.
compass, I believe, as well. And so I just remember, in the and in some ways, I'd love you to speak to this. The OECD as a think tank in Paris, quite influential. And this idea of looking at high achieving systems, and then realizing the journey, perhaps even your own professional journey, to note um, we are so much more than just the score. And so I'd love you to take us into that world because the OECD seems to really have a more nuanced and sophisticated way of talking about what success is today, far more than here in Australia, as you well know, having a single numerical score which determines your tertiary admissions ranking. So, what would you say are the things that you point to based on that, what we understand about human flourishing rather than just an achievement paradigm?
Yeah, this is, I think, the most fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves is no longer just, how we educate, but what's the purpose of education and what do we educate for? And yeah, we have the OECD Learning Compass, but actually, and more recently, we also incorporated those ideas into how we measure educational success. For example, if you look at the latest edition of the PISA assessment, yes, we measure success in academics, mathematics, science, problem solving, and so on. But we also measure things like psychological strengths and well-being. We look at, emotional resilience. We look at human agency. Can you
Mm,
mobilize your cognitive, social, emotional resources? We look at the strengths and quality of social relationships. We look at the capacity of students to see this world through different lenses and perspectives. Can you appreciate different ways of thinking? Can you engage with plurality? All of those kinds of issues. And when you do that, you can suddenly see that, some education systems may be very good at the academics, sometimes at the expense of other, social emotional outcomes. And other countries actually build academics through social and emotional outcomes and actually do well on both sides of the spectrum. So I think that's really, really interesting that you can see when you look at educational outcomes through a multidimensional lens, you can see the relative strengths and weaknesses, and you can suddenly see how they are actually mirrored in how teachers interact with students, how teachers work, the way the work of teachers is organized. And that's really, I think, the learning compass. It helps you to look fresh at education systems in a way that is, relevant to the future of people and our systems.
One of the things that struck me the most, strikes me still, as we update this work for 2040, is this idea that collective well-being is a shared destination. And I just find that immediately you change the frame of reference, and the questions that we ask are different. Uh, Unfortunately, a lot of the discourse we see in media is about the decline in results. And and I'd love you to talk through what you're seeing globally around the decline and perhaps, the impact. And we're having some interesting conversations at the moment in California about big tech and its role on impacting cognition and mental health. And so we'll see how those land. But then also, what's the positive story here? The sense of belonging. And you're talking really like social cognition. Schools are not, as potentially people thought, disappearing, Andreas. They are becoming even more important spaces for belonging, for these social and emotional skills with that academic rigor to exist. So tell us a little bit about, the map over the last couple of decades. What have you noticed?
I do think that the decline in academic results is a real problem. You have many young people who, you know, have difficulties distinguishing fact from opinion, who
Mm,
navigate complex material. and that, I think, should concern us. The question is that the cause or is that the effect of the way we learn? And at the very same time, that we see how students' sense of belonging, the question of is school a place where I find out who I am, why I'm here on that planet, what the world needs from me, how I can discover, where I can become really good at and serve a social purpose, that is often a very important driver also of academic success. Now, I think we should not think about, academic outcomes at the expense of social emotional outcomes, but again, academic outcomes through those factors. And as you say, school is the first place where you actually encounter that. School has a very, very important role. And if you only think about learning as a transactional business, well, you can question whether we need school. Couldn't we sit everybody behind a screen with a good, AI-based kind of learning system? And probably when it comes to transmission of knowledge, to some extent, that's going to work. No? But that will not make us human. That will make us second-class robots, not first-class humans, really. And I think that's where we need to design school much more intentionally as a social space. In the way we talk about it, we assume it sort of is because it's always a place where people relate to. But, still a lot of time students spend behind individual desks, learning
Mm.
some form of content and at the end being tested whether they are better than their neighbor. That is actually, working against that mission. I think technology certainly pushes us to think about the mission of school. What is it that we want to achieve? What is the role of a teacher? Are you, just, transmitting knowledge, or are you a coach? Are you a mentor? Are you a designer of, personalized learning environments? I think those questions really come to the forefront now.
Mm. I'm really interested in the evolving role of an educator today. And I think this, educator as instructor versus educator as activator or facilitator or guide. And of course, there's, as the purpose of education perhaps shifts, what are you seeing in different systems that do this work well, where there isn't just a reductionist transmission understanding of I teach, you learn. There's perhaps a more nuanced of I create conditions and experiences in which you learn.
Yeah, I think in the last years, we have seen in many countries a quite unhealthy trend towards kind of commodifying education. We see
Yeah.
students as consumers of learning content. We see teachers as some kind of service provider to facilitate that. We see parents as a kind of client of this school, and that has actually created some really unhealthy distances. Almost, challenged the core of education, which is always, we are in that together. This is our joint experiences. This is about the environment that we create jointly, and you can see that, in that decline of students' motivation, student sense of belonging.
Mm.
You can see that in sometimes, teaching not no longer becoming a very attractive job. And I think that's something that we really need to challenge. I almost also say, we perhaps even on the part of teachers themselves, we see many education systems where education has outsourced social responsibilities of teachers to some other professionals. That may look very convenient. Okay, now I have a teaching assistant and a
Mm.
psychologist who can take over some of the tasks. But, ask yourself in the systems where you see that what this means in practice. It means that the students who may need you most will no longer see you because they are, being cared about by some specialist. It may mean that your own perspective of diversity is being reduced to a much more myopic version. It means that you spend more time maybe teaching, but less time spending with students outside the formal kind
Mm.
of classroom environment. And when I look at really high-performing education systems, and by that I mean systems that do well on the academics, that do well on social, that do well on emotional outcomes, typically, teachers have a broad range of responsibilities. They may teach a few hours less, but
Interesting.
they certainly spend a few hours more with students outside the classroom setting. And, we can actually measure that when we look at this through the student perspective. It's really interesting. When you
Yeah.
ask students, do you believe your teacher knows who you are and who you want to become? The answers may very be different across education systems. We have one question in PISA where we ask students, if you come back to your school 3 years from now, do you think your teachers will be excited to see you? And you can actually
Mm.
see when students respond positively, everything works. The academics work,
Yeah.
the motivation is there. Everything is positive. When students say no, and it's all about transmission and transaction, and we've lost that kind of social dimension of teaching, then and in some countries, England was the first country where, teachers
Mm.
15 years ago complained, I have a lot of disciplinary problems in my class. I have, I can no longer do justice to students. I needed teaching assistants. And then, at that time, the government said, okay, let's give every teacher a teaching assistant. And you just teach a couple of hours more. And therefore, as a replacement for that, you get this teaching assistant. But, 15 years later, teachers are not any happier. They have not seen any
Interesting.
reduction in their stress. They have seen their work becoming more monotonous, more focused on, they've lost contact to many students who need the most. And I think that's something that we should take to heart, how we define that set of responsibilities of teachers. And both, from the side of, students and from the side of the education profession.
Mm. Gosh, that's so beautifully put, Andreas. And I'm really pleased there's data to back that up. Sometimes, I feel like we're a bit of a broken record in education saying, relationships are the foundation for everything else. And of course, we can become too obsessed with that and lose the rigor. But it is a noticing for me as well that I think in some global education systems, and I'll talk about Australia, which I know the best, there is this interesting agenda, which is we can package somehow education as if it is a simple problem rather than a complex problem. And the input output, I do this, you do that, and it works. And, cognitive load theory and other theories here are quite popular at this point in time. Um, but I'd love you to talk more about these systems that seem to be able to do this well. And I know that in some of your latest reports, you've called out these and some of the features to them, the role of the teacher being one. But what else do we know about these systems that seem to, in terms of the equity and excellence connection as well, is an interesting thing to also unpick.
Yeah, we had just had our annual summit of the teaching profession in Estonia. And that's an amazing system. It's a
Mm.
system that actually works with very limited resources simply because Estonia is a comparatively poor country. But you look at the trajectory over the last 20 years, and it's just amazing how that system has reinvented itself, almost,
Mm.
almost multiple times. Technology. I visited the kindergarten during that experience, and you had one educator with 24 small kids, it's 5-year-olds. And you think, wow, how is this going to work? This is
Mm.
impossible. This is a workload and so on. But then actually when you saw it, it was simply amazing. First of all, this was an educator who was highly educated, highly motivated. You could really see this is someone who is realizing her dream in this kindergarten. And,
Wow.
they were out in the snow. They were making a fire there. In my own country, in Germany, if children make a fire, you have, 13 policemen standing around making security. All here you had the children doing fire and the teacher, giving, some calm advice, but the children learn to organize themselves, to take responsibility for
Mm.
themselves, for other people. The teacher's role was about to create that environment. Do they learn to read and write? Actually, that's not the focus in kindergarten in Estonia. It's about building curiosity. It's about building those human qualities that later on, when you get in school, you have all that energy and you start right through. And at age 15, you surpass students in Australia
Mm.
by a large margin on the academics. But I think
Yes.
doing the right thing at the right time, focusing very much at the quality of social relationships, creating that environment in which learning happens. You cannot push a rope. You cannot simply, make this a kind of deal, a kind of transaction. And you need to get, the learner into your space. And that's an example where you could see that. And equity is a natural outcome of those kinds of systems. It doesn't come from smaller classes. It doesn't come from, specific kind of material. It comes from, the teacher being aware of each and every student and their needs and their purposes and their intentions and then creating the right conditions, often with the help of, specialists without any question. I think that all comes very natural, but that's just, one type of education system. And
Mm.
you can find many of them. I mean, we look at those things often in a quite abstract way through data and numbers. I always look at the
Sure.
kind of system ones I've seen, they are so successful. What lies behind of those success? What can I see in terms of pattern here? And, for the most interesting finding for me as a scientist is that 75% of the variation in outcomes you can explain with things that we can observe. There is still,
Wow.
some magic behind things that we don't really understand, but most of the things that actually lead to the success of education are ones that we can actually, name, that we can. Whether we live them is another question, but there it's not,
100%.
rocket science really.
Yeah. I love that. Um, it feels quite empowering, actually, Andreas, to be able to be. And so, of course, then there's the knowing, doing. Well, there's the first of all the gap to know what those things are, and then and you called this piece in as well, and then there's the kind of the embodiment of that. And again, I wonder what your reflection on building capabilities would be at a system level. When you think about how do you see teachers go from a novice, maybe very passionate, as I first was when I walked into my first classroom, passionate, but only with a pretty limited toolkit at that point in time. Yeah, how do you see systems really support the holistic development of the adults and the professionals in these environments so that you can walk into a classroom and see a pretty consistently passionate, attuned, understanding the social fabric, but also being able to deploy some of the academic rigor? What are some of the
Yeah.
features of those capability building models?
Clearly, passion is important. I think the first thing a student will see in you as a teacher, whether you own your subject, whether you live that with passion. And that's, one of the reasons why sometimes, vocational education training is more engaging for kids than, academic education. When you work with
Mm,
people who do their job, who you work with real people, you work on real problems, you make mistakes that have real consequences. So I think that passion is very important, but we shouldn't underestimate the importance of professional competence. In 1 month, we are going to release results from our first survey of teacher professional pedagogical knowledge. And what
interesting.
you will see there is that the most powerful predictor on academic learning outcomes is actually that deep understanding of pedagogy on teachers. So passion alone is a start,
Mm,
but you need structure. You need actually to have the deep understanding of how students learn and how different students learn differently. And we have the tools to engage with this. And those kinds of tools change as time evolves. Think about, new technologies. Think about, increasing social diversity. You cannot prepare yourself for life as a teacher. Now, we used to learn to become a teacher, and now learning is being a teacher. Now, I really
yes.
think that transformation, that as a teacher, you need to be a learner, you need to be open, you need to be willing to question your own practices. Are those still the most relevant tools? How has the context changed? How are my students evolving? I mean, that's again
Mm,
one of the risks of AI, that you rely on learning analytics to predict behavior based on what you saw in other students. Your role as a teacher is to see what's unique in that person in front of me. How is this person different? What can I do for him or her? And I think that's really, I think, something that that combination of yes, passion for your subject, passion for your students, but then also a good level of structure and the willingness and capacity of teachers to grow and evolve. And I think often that's what we miss in our education systems. We have still that idea, you get your degree, then you're
mm,
ready, and then you're on your own in the classroom. That's also why, professional autonomy is only one side of the coin. The more
mm.
important part to make it work is actually a collaborative culture where teachers work together to frame good practice. Again, you asked me for a hallmark of a high performing education system.
Yeah.
It's that collaborative culture, that learning environment. Yes, I share my experience from my classroom. I engage in research, in understanding and advancing the profession, my own and that of my colleagues. And I think that is something, creating that space for that, creating the support. That's really, I think, the best way how we can advance teacher capabilities. Sometimes I think, well, you may make the entry easier. Why actually requiring people to study for many years before they get into a classroom? Why not, starting that process earlier, but then redoubling our effort to help people
Mm.
grow in their profession? And
Yeah, I feel like the plateau is a challenge for all of us as adults, and I think even it's still a bit of a revelation for many adults to realize that schooling is not learning. And just
mm,
because you finish school or you've done your macro credentials and postgraduate, you know, uh, you're yourself really at the center of global learning, constantly learning. It's kind
mm,
of the paradox of it'll never end, Andreas. I really love this takeaway you said, you cannot push a rope. I've never heard that before. And I find something around the motivational conditions, both for adults and young people, to come to a physical space,
mm.
to be embodied in some way. Really, really compelling. I've only got two final questions for you out of this list of 100 they've got. But one is, what do you still think we're overvaluing and undervaluing in our education conversations? What do we think we're kind of missing?
Yeah, I think what we overvalue is, the importance of prefabricated knowledge. I mean, when I said, we have too many young people who cannot distinguish fact from opinion, navigate ambiguity, it's not because those things are so hard to learn. It is because much of education is still designed to make you believe something. No, I
Mm,
mean, I'm a scientist, you can see how we often teach science like religion. We make you believe in some scientific theory. We give you lots of exercises to practice this. At the end, we test whether you can reproduce the answers that we projected into this. Has, by the way, nothing to do with science. Science is always about questioning what we know, not about reproducing what we know. But that's still very much something that we do in education because we've always done that. So that's overvalued also because, again, that's where technology challenges us most. I think what is undervalued is that, human growth, seeing failure as an opportunity to support that human growth. What we
mm,
undervalue is also, again, the quality of social relationships,
mhm,
not just in their own weight, but also as an important, predictor of student engagement, student motivation, students' academic growth. And I think that's something. It happens when you have an amazing teacher. That's very clear, but it doesn't happen necessarily because the way we design our education systems. And I think that's something that probably we can do a lot better.
fantastic. Final question for you, Andreas. What's your take-home message for listeners? What is something you want to resonate them to sit with in their own journey of curiosity? Let's call it.
Well, I think never before has the role of a teacher been more important than it is today, but also never before has it become so interesting. I really believe if we use technology well, it can free us of the kind of things that, cause stress, like administrative work, transmission of content and so on. It can actually, put teaching back to its core mission. If you get before the time of school, we all learned through apprenticeship. We didn't, have that kind of very structured approach. We learn from and with people, and I do think
Mm,
that is, when you ask teachers in Australia, elsewhere, why did you become a teacher? Most will respond, it's because I want to build human relationships. I want to support young people in their learning growth, and I think we now have that possibility to make this happen. No?
mm. Andreas, thank you so much for joining us and for the work you continue to champion out of the OECD. It's an absolute delight. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Pleasure.